Welcome to the final program of our colloquium on imaginative freedom and political freedom, presented by the MPC Great Books Program. I'm David Clemens, Great Books Program Coordinator, and I want to thank the Monterey County Weekly for its support and recognize the indispensable contributions of Jeanette Haxton, Michelle Brock, Rosa Arroyo, Julie Brown-Smith, and Aaron Burke, who handled the tickets tonight, and the MPC Humanities Division. Our colloquiums have been made possible by the extraordinary generosity of the APGAR Foundation, and any further programs will depend on whether I am successful in another grant application. But I want to thank them again and again for their generous and steadfast support. Our previous speakers in this series were Claire Cavanaugh, whose book Lyric Poetry and Modern Politics is now a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in nonfiction. She is, as she puts it, over the moon. She's so excited. There followed Mark Bauerlein, former research director of the National Endowment for the Arts, teacher, essayist, blogger, and author of The Dumbest Generation, a book title that produced a pretty big turnout of people who wanted to take issue. And in December, a special edition with Zachary Mason, author of the lavishly praised Lost Books of the Odyssey. Tonight, we are incredibly fortunate to welcome Mark Edmundson, distinguished scholar, author, and professor at the University of Virginia. He will speak to us, take some questions, and then sign books for you. Mark is the author, most recently, of a marvelous memoir, The Fine Wisdom and Perfect Teachings of the Kings of Rock and Roll. But permit me a moment to remark on an earlier book, Why Read? Because it is a textbook for my course, Introduction to Great Books. Recently, 4 different students, Jonathan, Adam, Gina, and Jennifer, told me that while reading Mark's book, they felt as if he was speaking specifically about them, even, as Jennifer said, reading her mind. Why Read is very much about the life-changing, sometimes life-saving effect of imaginative literature. As our society becomes more and more one that does not read, the consequences are sociological and political as well as personal. Mark's argument for reading is a powerful, eloquent, and necessary reminder that reading toughens and expands the private, unitary inner self to which Cavanaugh alludes, that reading resists the electronic slavery that Bauerlein describes, and that reading allows that endless reimagining of which Mason speaks. Why Read begins with Mark quoting William Carlos Williams, who wrote, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." They die miserably because something is found there and can be found again. But what happens, asks Edmundson, and this is a quote, "Now and in the future, if our most intelligent students never learn to strive to overcome what they are? What if aspirations to genius and to contact with genius become silly, outmoded ideas? What you're likely to get are more and more two-dimensional men and women. These will be people who live for easy pleasure, for comfort and prosperity and the satisfactions of cool, who think of money first, then second, and third, who hug the status quo, who believe in God as a sort of insurance policy, cover your bets, people who are never surprised. They will be people so pleased with themselves, when they're not in despair at the general pointlessness of their lives, that they cannot imagine that humanity could do better. They'll think it their highest duty to have themselves cloned as often as possible. They'll claim to be happy, and they'll live a long time." I would add that those people are already here. We see them in the stores and in the streets and in the classrooms. People who are numb and empty and who have never found what is there in poetry and literature. Mark, however, offers a way out with what he calls a democratic humanism informed by the imagination. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mark Edmundson.
Thank you so much. That's very eloquent and very generous. Tonight, what I'm going to talk to you about is self and soul. The name of the paper is actually Self and Soul, the Modern Dilemma. This paper is not all that easy as it goes, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's in it. I hope it's not condescending at all. It's not meant to be. I'm going to use two terms, self and soul, and I'm going to say that at any given time we are in the state of self or the state of soul. State of self is the state when we're trying to prosper, to get along, to succeed, to achieve a certain kind of balance, a certain kind of happiness, and to live as long as possible. State of soul is a state where you achieve what I like to call unity of being. State of soul is arrived at through, based on my study of the Western tradition, I hope this isn't too presumptuous, 4 ways: through the exercise of courage, the exercise of compassion, the exercise of the intellect, and the exercise of the imagination. Right? I'm going to suggest that in society now, and this is somewhat in line with the passage that David just read, self has triumphed almost entirely, and soul is fast in retreat. And yet, I'm also going to say that human beings, being what they are, they can never quite live without the inducements and the possibilities offered by soul. So here we go. This is new work. Indulge me. I hope there's something in it for you. I truly do. You came out here to hear me in the rain. If there's just a little bit, I'll be very grateful. I want to talk about human life, our life. I want to talk about why, for most of us in the West, life has gotten as miserable as it has. And I want to talk about what can be done to change this sad state. I say miserable because misery is what I see, even among the most successful and prosperous. The mass of men, Thoreau said more than 150 years ago, lead lives of quiet desperation. That is yet truer now than it was when Thoreau wrote. Rich as we may be, accomplished as we may seem, misery is our common human lot. We can do better. Why are we miserable? Let me answer that question somewhat enigmatically to start. We are miserable because we seek happiness. What is this happiness, this delusion we pursue? It is the satisfaction of what I will be calling self. We have invested in the aspirations of the self, and we have forgotten, indeed we have obscured and denigrated the aspirations of the soul. Self is not necessarily a negative term for me. In fact, being able to affirm self may at times be necessary for human survival. But human beings are in desperate trouble when they affirm the values of the self exclusively. And they're in a state of purgatorial suffering, purgatory without end, when they attempt to deceive themselves and to believe that the self can attain the grandeurs of the soul, that the self, in fact, is the soul. The conjunction of these two terms, self and soul, is not original with me. They are to be found in dialectical tension in the works of William Blake and Walt Whitman and William Butler Yeats. And though my use of the terms will differ from the uses made by these 3 masters, I am beholden to them all. It will take some time and the length of an entire book fully to define and elaborate my conceptions of self and soul. What begins as a simple opposition of 2 terms necessarily grows at times more complex. But to start, it will be useful to make some preliminary observations. I want self and soul to be understood not as permanent conditions or permanent identities, but as states of being. Self and soul are states of being. So one man or woman can be said to be living the life of self and self only. Another can be said, however temporarily, to be in the state of pure soul. I equate self with desire in the most immediate and personal sense. Self lives to want, and as we shall see, wants more than anything else to live. A bourgeois, says Camus, in a line that could serve as an epigraph for this entire inquiry, is someone whose primary desire is to live as long as possible. Self wishes to live as long as possible. Self is that which endorses and advances the vital force that Schopenhauer calls the will to life. Self, then, is the agent of desire. But what sort of desire? To begin with, self is the agent of individual desire. Self is the agent of individual desire. Self wants good health, good food, fitness, and prosperity. It wants longevity too, of course. It wants to live forever in the body. Some people, says the philosopher comic Woody Allen, want to achieve immortality through their works. I want to achieve it through not dying. Allen's best humor reveals the longings of the self, mocks those longings as entirely unworthy, and yet affirms them as the only longings that can possibly exist. To Allen, as to his Viennese foster father, Freud, affirmations of soul are always fraudulent. The self wants sex, money, prestige, and power. The self is worldly. That is, it does not dispute the values of the world, but tries to navigate them, and through them, to find happiness. The soul seeks, dare one say it, joy. Dangerous joy. The self wants what it wants, and that is an end to it. Pleasure, power, position. But the self installed in a bourgeois world, which is the world that best expresses the self's aspirations, understands that what it desires, it must not take by force. Thus the self is also the seat of the civilized virtues: prudence, duty, consideration, familial love, restraint, politeness, modesty, deference, respect for others, awareness of rank and station. The self, as Freud taught us, is divided within and against itself. The id or it wants and only wants. It is the core of desire, the core of the self. But in society, the desires of the self cannot be pursued nakedly and immediately. The ego modulates and directs desire. It enforces the rule of deferral. The superego castigates the psyche for certain desires, sometimes beyond the point of reason. But desire is at the core of the self, as described by Freud, and for Freud, there is only self. One might say that Freud, probably the greatest mind of the 20th century, expends his vast intellect on two tasks. First, he portrays in every phase of being the individual who is defined by desires, that is to say, defined by the self. Second, he struggles to discredit and destroy anything and everything associated with soul. It is commonplace now to say that Freud is no longer relevant. His thinking is outmoded. Some claim that his perceptions have been sifted and the best of them integrated into the science that is modern psychology. In this, there may be some grain of truth. More centrally, Freud has disappeared temporarily from the cultural horizon because the battle that he fought seems to be over and won. Self, in our culture, has triumphed over soul. To be sure, Freud had something to do with this triumph, though it is not his triumph per se. The grinding force of capitalism that Marx described so well has far more to do with the triumph of self over soul than do Freud's 24 plump volumes. The middle class, the heart of the culture of self, no longer has any need for intellectual justification. Freud is difficult and complex, and his sense of what life offers within the kingdom of the self is anything but optimistic. He does not really like the soulless life, but for reasons of his own he affirms it nonetheless. Perhaps more to the point, Freud's version of a creditable life within the state of self is far more demanding, difficult, and perhaps genuinely rich than anything that the current culture of self could possibly embrace. Thus I summon Freud, and will continue to do so throughout these reflections. I will do so not because he represents the commonplace affirmation of self that has achieved rampant victory in the West. That vision is thin, pragmatic, unself-aware, and often rather boring. In contemporary mainstream culture, self does not question itself, especially after the fall of Marx and all that was associated with him. Self lived in its own paradise, which is in truth a purgatory, an air-conditioned nightmare, as Henry Miller liked to call it. No, I summon Freud because no one better affirms the necessity to commit to the self, despite the allure of soul. But most of all, I summon him because no one better anatomizes the dangers that arise when human beings pass into the state of the soul. What then are soul values? What are the states of the soul? I must begin by answering in a somewhat circular way. They are the states that middle-class men and women most fear and, on certain levels, are ultimately most drawn to. For the self without access to soul states must always feel incomplete, inadequate. This is one of the major reasons, though there are others, that self is forever in a state of anxiety and disappointment. Why does self fear death as much as it does? Why does the bourgeois want to live as long as possible? Self senses that it never really has lived. And this is true. A being who has not entered the state of soul has never actually been alive. Will more security protect you from fears about time? No, only being outside of time, in the state of soul, delivers one from the grinding force of temporality. I count 4 major versions of the soul state, the state that brings with it unity of being in the Western tradition. 3 of them arising from the ancient world, 1 from the modern. Homer is the great poet and the slightly ambivalent advocate of the first of the great soul states, courage. Homer's vision of Achilles and of Hector, the unsurpassable warrior without fear and the humane, brave citizen soldier, have rung for more than 2,500 years through Western culture, though they probably never have been diminished as they are now. Narcissism, Freud would call military heroism. The delusion of the group mind, he would call the bravery that sends men rushing over the trench and into battle. As to today's middle-class man, he admires fighting men and women from afar, or affects to do so. As to sending his own children, or going off himself to win glory or defend his way of life, that is not generally his concern. But step into one of our military academies, and you will find men and women who understand heroic values as if by instinct. They knew 2 things that their ostensibly more cultivated and surely more materially privileged contemporaries do not. First, they understand, as Plato did, that war is eternal. Perhaps it is not the essential state of humanity, but war will always exist, never pass away. Plato can imagine a time when there would be no warfare between the Greek states, but that is as far as he can go in his vision of peace. Second, all true fighters then and now understand that wars are won by individual warriors. You can deploy all the technology you like. You can bomb your enemy from above. You can assault him with drones from half a world away. But eventually you and your comrades will have to go where the enemy is, encounter him face to face, and kill or capture him. The next great soul state embraced by humanity, East and West, would seem to be, and indeed almost is, the inverse of the first. I call this second soul state the state of compassion, and for us in the West it is epitomized by Jesus Christ. Jesus is, I believe, a figure who is not well understood. There are many points at which it seems to me Jesus requires something like fresh interpretation, or at least the revival of the teachings of the man who may be his best interpreter, the poet William Blake. How does Blake see Jesus? Consider a brief instance. In the Gospel according to Mark, a young man asks Jesus precisely what he needs to do in order to be saved. He wants to attain heaven. Jesus tells him that he should love God and keep the commandments. But the young man wants to do more. Very well then, the Savior says, sell everything you have and give it to the poor and follow me. But the young man cannot do it. Jesus' commandment to free the soul completely from the domination of the self is too hard for him to obey. When he heard this, Mark tells us, he was shocked and went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Yet if the young man did as Jesus instructed, he would attain an immediate joy, an immediate unity of being, not altogether unlike what the warrior attains when he puts his fear aside and acts with complete courage and conviction. What Jesus offers, Blake would tell us, is not salvation at the judgment seat. What Jesus offers is the overcoming of self, which will result in heaven right now, right here on this earth. Come and follow me. One of Jesus' most oft-spoken utterances means shuck self and live in your soul now. Doing so can bring great joy and also enormous risk. Too much risk, too much for potential for delusion. That young man in the Gospel of Mark and his many middle-class descendants would tell us. To turn to the life of compassion is perhaps not as perilous as turning to the life of the warrior, but its dangers are not inconsiderable, as generations of holy martyrs have shown us. Perilous, too, can be the life of the thinker, at least according to Plato. Once a man or a woman has left the cave of ignorance, where most mortals live amidst imitations and imitations of imitations, the journey is upward in the direction of the good. The good, Plato tells us, is much like the sun. It glows with a nearly supernatural brightness. It takes a while for the thinker in training to be able to look into its face. The good is so resplendent, so out of keeping with common and habitual things, that one cannot regard it straight on. The novice thinker must first look at the sun's reflections in pools and larger bodies of water. But in time, the one who pursues the third of the great ancient soul ideals, the ideal of truth, can stare directly into the heart of what is actual. He can stay where he is, enjoying the heaven of pure contemplation, Or he can, somewhat as the Buddha does, turn away from his vision of perfection and return to the people below in the cave of ignorance to try to teach them what he knows. And how do the people respond? They grow confused when the thinker presumes to tell them that the things that they consider to be most real and that they organize their lives around are merely illusions. The thinker tells them that they live for the temporary satisfactions of the self and not for the truth of the soul. And how do they respond? First they express confusion, then derision. Finally, if the thinker persists long enough, they will lay their hands on him and try to do him harm. The fate of the true thinker, the one who pursues the values of the soul, not who uses his mental talents to advance the fortunes of the self, will often be that of the warrior and the saint. Plato broods continually on the fate of his master Socrates, put to death by the Athenian court, ostensibly for corrupting the young, but actually for daring to think freely and express his thoughts. The creature dominated by self wants to live as long as possible. The individual who attempts to pass into the soul state must be willing to acknowledge that she might not live very long at all. The contemporary middle class is not in the habit of making martyrs of its thinkers. Its potential thinkers, one might say, have expeditiously martyred themselves. By and large, they have turned away from soul values. The current denizens of academia say that they are against authoritarianism and fundamentalism and logocentrism. But fundamentally, what they are against is ideals. The middle class is by its nature pragmatic. It cannot afford ideals, which are always a potential impediment to achieving wealth and success. Thus, the middle class sends its children to college, where professors of philosophy and literature teach them to scorn all ideal aspirations. The professorial demythologizers and deconstructionists do not subvert middle-class values. They serve middle-class values by relieving young people of their higher aspirations. Plato and his true descendants are now little more than a laughingstock in the Western university. One deconstructs their aspirations to pure and present truth. One replaces the quest for an eternal and binding vision with a commitment to pragmatism, the tacit philosophy of merchants and opportunists the world over. One sees one's vocation not in terms of the discovery, creation, or celebration of ideals, but in their destruction. Freud defines the thought of the modern West. He replaces transcendentalism with descendentalism. That is, he does not seek to find universal ideals, but to destroy the possibility of all ideals, be they ethical, religious, political, or artistic. To Freud's way of thinking, the worst, most dispiriting truth that one can tell about an individual or an idea is the most binding and central truth. The modern self rejects soul. It opts for pleasure, profit, power, and position. Itself, despite all the contemporary blandishments, cannot affect the rejection of soul with an entirely clear conscience. The happiness offered by the culture of self is not lasting, not substantial, not in line with a human being's higher aspirations. Desire, Schopenhauer shows us, is painful. We feel a lack. And the self is nothing if not the seat and source of desire. When one desire is satisfied, a moment of contentment supervenes, yes. Yet it is this fact that makes people continue on the road of self. There are moments of pleasure, moments of achieved happiness. The question becomes how to make the satisfaction of desire not temporary but constant, and that one cannot do. For soon another fresh and pain-creating want swarms in where the sated desire had been. As Schopenhauer summarizes matters, all willing springs from lack, from deficiency, and thus from suffering. Fulfillment brings this to an end. Yet for one wish that is fulfilled, there remains another dozen that are denied. Further, desiring lasts a long time. Demands and requests go on indefinitely. Fulfillment is short and meted out sparingly. But even the final satisfaction itself is only apparent. The wish fulfilled at once makes way for a new one. The former is a known delusion, the latter a delusion not yet known. No attained object of willing, which is to say no objects of the self's desires, can give a satisfaction that lasts and no longer declines, but it is always like the alms thrown to a beggar, which reprieves him today so that his misery may be prolonged until tomorrow. If, as Freud says, we are always divided within ourselves, at least, one might add, when we are in the state of self, satisfaction will always be compromised. A pleasure beloved by the id is anathema to the superego, and of equivocal value to the ego. If you cannot satisfy one part of the psyche without somehow punishing the rest, then all satisfaction in the realm of self will ultimately be found, as Freud says, to be rather unsatisfying. Excuse me. The self wants many things, but its wants collide with one another. They do so in ways that make the self's overall quest, the quest for happiness, very unlikely to be fulfilled. Excuse me. Glass residues of the flu. Oh. Freud is no celebrator of the bourgeois self, always searching, always incomplete, always at war within its own borders. He simply believes that a well-balanced, self-aware state of internal conflict is the best that almost anyone can hope for. He also fears the result of committing oneself to states of the soul, and he is in many ways right to do so. How often does the warrior become a sadist? How often is the spiritual teacher who preaches compassion a self-serving fraud? How frequently is there true wisdom to be gleaned from the purportedly wise? Illusion is costly, and no one better chronicles its cost than Freud. But do states of self always produce illusion, and illusion only? In its secret precincts, the self often knows and feels the inadequacy of its way of being. The soul state beckons. Achilles, Jesus, Socrates, Plato, and all they represent about what makes life worth living are a part of our cultural legacy, and maybe what they represent runs deeper than that. The life of the soul offers energy, intensity, meaning, and the condition that Yeats called unity of being. Those who live in the soul state live a blessed life, but also a surpassingly dangerous one. Those who pretend to the soul state but do not abide within it are among the most dangerous men and women, but the dangers of the soul do not stop there. Self longs for soul, and often soul badly needs the protection of self. Before Walt Whitman could write some of the most tender poetry in the language, he had to develop for himself a persona as Walt Whitman, one of the roughs, fleshly, sensual, eating and drinking. Only then, protected by his hyper-male carapace, could he unfold his vision of soul. Sometimes an individual leaves the state of self, as men and women do time and again in the gospel, where they leave what they are doing and what they are to go off and follow the Savior. But just as commonly, self attempts to fabricate soul. It replaces courage in combat with addiction to televised sports. It replaces compassion with judicious donation, tax deductible. Self replaces authentic thought with instrumental reason. It uses the mind energetically, resourcefully, vitally, but only to fulfill its practical needs. Self deploys what has been called the principle of instrumental reason in behalf of itself and only itself. For self, what Schopenhauer calls the principium individuationis, the principle of individuality, is always preeminent. What is contemporary culture, one might ask? It is in many ways the fabrication of soul. The football gridiron is the field of combat. The televised detective and the brilliant doctor, the diagnostician without equal, is the thinker in blandly displaced form. On the televised commercial, it is the soft drink rather than the saint that brings people together in a community of compassion, making the disunited into one. Soul brings unity of being, yes, but it is recognizable in another way as well. Soul brings joy to other men and women. The compassionate individual rescues others from poverty and want. He feeds the hungry and he gives comfort to the sick. He remembers the people that everyone forgets. The warrior defends his country against murderous attack, or he stands with his corps, his band of brothers and now sisters, and is loyal to them to the last breath. He will not let the bodies of his comrades fall into enemy hands. He will not leave a wounded friend. He will not retreat when retreat would cause his comrades to suffer. When an American Marine hears the simple four-word sentence, Marines are in trouble, he is up and moving, whatever the circumstances, or else he is no true Marine. As to the thinker, he tells the truth. He perceives the world as honestly and deeply as he possibly can. He makes his perceptions public for the good of all men and women. Then he takes the consequences. Sometimes his thought is welcome. The deeper he dives into the privatest and secretest presentiments, to his wonder he finds this is the most acceptable, the most public and universally true. The people delight in it. The better part of every man feels, this is my music, this is myself, as Emerson puts it. But more often, he meets with indifference or rejection, sometimes even with violence. The specter of Giordano Bruno burning at the stake for daring to release his findings to a hostile world looms for every genuine thinker. Yet the thinker goes on practicing his art for the benefit of those who will ignore him or persecute him, and for their descendants as well. One might say that many states can bring unity of being, or the illusion thereof. Riding a horse at top speed, playing a hard game of squash, surfing on an empty beach can all deliver a sense of pure presence. Psychologists like to call such experiences states of flow and wax eloquent on how needful they are to mental health and well-being. Fine. But such states bring nothing to anyone but the actor. They are forms of self-delight, no more. Soul states unify being, and they bring gifts to the world, which badly needs them. Exertions of the soul heal what is broken, close out old epochs, and begin new, or at least that is the objective. More often than not, since exertions of soul fail, but even the failures, such exertions of soul fail, but even the failures, if suffered with an open heart, are worth more than an endless string of the self's triumphs. When does the ascendancy of self begin in Western culture? Self has always been with us. It is a natural, a given. The origins of the soul are an enigma. But then, that does not mean we should ignore it. The true attitude to soul is perhaps Whitman's. I in this mystery, the poet says, here we stand. Self is by nature who and what we are, or at least a part of it. Yet there is a perceptible point at which self begins to defeat soul. Self commences to discredit and discipline it. Just so there is another point at which soul appears to reemerge. Soul must always be the bad conscience of self, even as self must always desire to be liberated from the dangerous and ennobling promise of soul. Shakespeare, the great literary critic Harold Bloom says, invents the human. Yes and no. To be more precise, Shakespeare, with his unequaled genius, helps clear the way for the inception of a modified version of humanity, one that radiates selfhood and to which soul is foreign. Shakespeare does not endorse this form of being, far from it, but he clears the ground for its triumph. Against Shakespeare? Can anyone actually write against Shakespeare, seeing him as an enemy of the soul? There is no denying Shakespeare's genius. He is, for all the conventionally adduced reasons and a few more, supreme among the poets. But often the energies of writers of genius are augmented by immense social energies. Genius is never created by social forces, but it can be enlarged, expanded by fusing itself with powerful historical movements. Shakespeare would have been an extraordinary writer at any time he was born. But being born when he was, he became supreme. Shakespeare's plays had major cultural work to do. They had to clear the way for the ascent of the rising middle class. It was left to Dickens to turn that class's story into something akin to, and also remarkably distinct from, an epic. The combined force of Shakespeare's genius and the forward motion of the times. Speaking of the forward motion of capital as accurate but not unreductive, results in 38 astonishing plays, at least a dozen of them works of the highest art, 154 brilliant sonnets, and superb long poems as well. Much the same can be said of the actual laureate of the self, Charles Dickens. The task of affirming the ascendancy of the self, albeit the self in its most decent, humane form, brought out novels from him in larval waves and sent Dickens out on dramatic reading tours that consumed so much energy that they helped to bring on early death. Dickens ambivalently celebrated self. Shakespeare opened self's way, though without liking it very much. Large spirits both, they interfused those spirits with massive forces of social change and created work that still astounds. How did Shakespeare clear the ground, perform his massive escases? Again, Bloom can be helpful. Shakespeare, Bloom says, had a precursor whom he struggled to surpass and in time did. This was Christopher Marlowe. And in this observation, there's truth. Shakespeare does surge beyond Marlowe in the invention of character, creating figures who possess an immodern interior life. Marlowe creates great cartoons who are always emphatically themselves. Shakespeare gives us figures who reveal depth after depth of sometimes contradictory wishes, dreams, aspirations, and desires. But the truth is that Shakespeare's most consequential precursor is not Marlowe, but Homer, whom he read in Chapman's translation. For if Shakespeare's work is anything, it is anti-heroic. It is an extended polemic against all authors and individuals who have endorsed the heroic code. It attacks the virtue of Achilles and even of Hector brutally and comprehensively. This fact does not go entirely unnoticed. The Marxist critic Arnold Hauser sees that Shakespeare's work is an assault on the declining class of nobles, an assault launched in the implicit interests of the middle class. But his insight has been little developed with the empire of Shakespeare criticism, for reasons that should in a certain way be evident. Shakespeare is literature's great anti-idealist. Virtually any figure in his plays who commits unequivocally to the heroic code is doomed to death, humiliation, or both. Think of Titus Andronicus, Othello, Macbeth, Hotspur, Coriolanus, Caesar, the Antony of Antony and Cleopatra, whom Shakespeare appears to sympathize with most among his heroic figures. But then Antony is a lover as well as a warrior, which we will see makes a difference. Consider the entire cast of what is by far Shakespeare's most bitter play, the little red and brilliant Troilus and Cressida, in which Shakespeare takes Homer's full panoply of heroes and submits them to rabid indignity and degradation. Achilles is an idiot, Patroclus a male whore, Hector a pasteboard hero, Ajax a fool beyond measure. Thersites, the hateful foot soldier who speaks no more than 20 lines in Homer, denouncing Agamemnon and all the heroes, takes over Shakespeare's play and becomes its presiding spirit. As Hauser puts it, for however highly Shakespeare the dramatist places the decorative value of chivalry, he cannot reconcile himself to the unrestrained hedonism, the thoughtless hero cult, the wild, unruly individualism of his class. Sir John Falstaff, Sir Toby Belch, Sir Andrew Aguecheek are shameless parasites. Achilles, Ajax, Hotspur, idle, swaggering bullies. The Percys, Glendowas, Mortimers, ruthless egoists, and Lear is a feudal despot in a state where heroic, knightly moral principles reign supreme, and where nothing gentle, affectionate, and unassuming has a chance of survival. Shakespeare's relationship to heroism is not simple. Then and now, figures who commit themselves to the heroic provoke fascination. They provide the greatest entertainment. In a sense, Shakespeare loves these figures. His drama cannot live without them. People want to see them ennobled and see them sacrificed. It is not the death and rebirth of a seasonal fertility god that people are drawn to in Shakespeare's tragedy, as Nietzsche suggests. It is the death and rebirth in the next play and the next of the hero, the man who commits himself to loyalty and to courage, and by whom the middle class is both fascinated and frightened. But ultimately, Shakespeare's vision of chivalry is about as vitriolic as the vision of his precise contemporary, Miguel de Cervantes. The old order passes, and both Shakespeare and Cervantes strive to make of the passing something as brutal and irrevocable as possibly can be. And what about the other ancient ideals, contemplation and compassion? The ongoing critical debate about whether Shakespeare, the man, was a Catholic or not, obscures the fundamental point that in all religious terms, Shakespeare the playwright seems to be absolutely nothing at all. The most flagrantly religious of his characters, Isabella in Measure for Measure, is almost madly sadomasochistic. Sex and punishment seem to be intertwined inextricably in her mind. The overtly Christian characters in Merchant of Venice, Christian in contrast to Shylock's Judaism, are by and large materialists, opportunists, and profligates. And in their treatment of Shylock, they are not far short of being sadists. In general, to be a monk, a priest, or a prelate in Shakespeare is to be a figure of corruption. Recall the turncoat friar in Romeo and Juliet, the bishops who torment and eventually burn Joan and Henry VI, the crooked churchmen who justify the invasion of France at the beginning of Henry V. But in general, Shakespeare gives religion the silent treatment. None of his central figures are defined by their faith. He constantly sets his plays in pre-Christian times and non-Christian lands, as well as in latter-day Italy, the land of barbarous Catholicism, which is to say paganism of a certain sort. Shakespeare does not condemn religion as he does the heroic ideal. Shakespeare simply spends his time imagining worlds in which people are, for better or for worse, far away from Christianity and its injunctions about human compassion. Shakespeare opens the way for an entirely pragmatic world where there are no abiding or transcendent values. What is valuable within the world of the plays is that which conforms to the uses of the self, pleasure and power. There is no other standard. It is almost always an error to quote Shakespeare, though we do so all the time. Nearly every Shakespearean utterance has two salient qualities, a context and a subtext. Shakespeare's characters talk pragmatically. They talk in order to help themselves to get what they want within the context of other actors who are also striving to fulfill their desires. Their subtext is their desire, their hope for pleasure or power, which must be disguised because it is in conflict with the aspirations of other characters. When we quote Shakespeare, we bring with us the context and the subtext. We reproduce the desires, almost always self-serving, of the actors whom we quote. We say that there's a tide in the affairs of men which must be met at its crest, not recalling that the speaker Brutus has assassinated an emperor and is now urging his friend Cassius on to bloody battle, which they will lose. We say that one should neither a borrower nor a lender be, forgetting that the speaker is the meddling fool Polonius who uses his daughter as a pawn in court politics and sends his servants out to spy on his own son. To remember context and subtext in Shakespeare is to be reinscribed into a world of contending desires and contradictory and self-interested views. To quote Shakespeare is not to evoke eternal wisdom, but to evoke highly self-interested individuals straining to make their ways in the world. There is, as Auden tells us, a period during which the utterances of Shakespeare's characters can sometimes stand alone as detached, impersonal reflections, as attempts, in other words, to articulate the truth. Hamlet offers multiple instances of such speech, but Auden also notes other instances. Ulysses' speech on order and degree in Troilus and Cressida, the king's on honor and all's well that ends well, and the duke's on death and measure for measure. To this one might add the philosophical longings occasionally manifest in the sonnets. But with the possible exception of Hamlet, there are no philosopher heroes, tragic or otherwise, in Shakespeare. One cannot imagine him writing a play based on the life of Dr. Faustus, as Marlowe did and as Goethe famously will. His Prospero comes with the trappings of a thinker, but throughout the course of the play expresses nothing that one could call distinguished thought. Another pregnant observation of Bloom's comes into play here. From his vantage, Freud is Shakespeare's true inheritor. The inheritance that Freud receives from Shakespeare, whom he reads in English from early on in his life, is not simply a matter of concepts. Freud may have learned something about ambivalence from Shakespeare, something about the unconscious, something about the dynamics of repression, and he may even have taken some clues that helped him to formulate the Oedipal complex. But what Freud shares preeminently with Shakespeare are values. Freud has only contempt for the heroic, which he stigmatizes in at least three ways. He despises religion in all forms. He uses his brilliant mind to attempt to destroy all ideals, including, ultimately, the idea of the thinker in his ideal guise. One must insist, of course, that Shakespeare does not terminate the great ideals, nor does Freud. Forces far larger than they challenge the ideals. Nor can anything terminate the three great ideals completely. Courage, compassion, and contemplation do not disappear from the world after Shakespeare, but at the inception of the modern period, and critics are right to call Shakespeare an early modern writer, the ideals suffer a severe reversal. It comes from Shakespeare, yes, it comes from Cervantes, certainly, but it comes preeminently from social forces that transcend any individual will. Ceaseless innovation, says Marx, the overthrow of all apparently stable values, comes with the rise of capital, as everything that appears to be solid melts into air. Constant revolutionizing and production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social relations, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all times. But self, I'm coming to a close here, self cannot abide supreme forever. The young people will not allow it so. The world, the young Wordsworth says, is too much with us late and soon. By the world, Wordsworth means what the staunchly believing Christian means, worldliness, the hunger for pleasure, power, health, and supremacy, the time to make money and the leisure in which to spend it. The romantics cry out against the apotheosis of self and what they perceive as the death or near death of the soul. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, Wordsworth continues. So much we see that isn't in it. So much we see in nature that is not ours. The earth has become an alien place, dominated by individualism, selfishness, greed, and narrow desires. In London, his great and highly compressed prophetic poem about the state of the late 18th century world, William Blake finds three centers of Eurasianic domination by the spirit of self. They are the imperial army, the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls, the church, the infant sweeper's cry every blackening church appalls, and most of all erotic life, the youthful harlot curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. But Blake is out to end these wrongs by helping his fellow men and women to break their mind-forged manacles. Freud says that where id was, ego will be. Freud prophesies a day when where Urizen was, Eros, the army, the church, there the renewed and rejuvenated soul will be. The Romantics seek new possibilities for passing from the state of self to the soul state. They are skeptical about contemplation, which to them means reductive enlightenment rationalism, as well as about compassion, which they associate with the corrupt and weary established church, and two, with courage, which they see as too closely associated with imperialism. The imperialism of the countries that attempted to suppress the revolution in France, and then the imperialism of France itself as it passes under the rule of Napoleon and seeks to conquer Europe. The Romantics look for other routes to the soul state, unity of being. And they are routes that are paradoxically enough opened up by Shakespeare. Shakespeare, the great writer of comedies, he wrote his comedies with a natural ease, Dr. Johnson said he strained after his tragedies, is not averse to the sentiment of love. His comedies end in marriage. He never tires of the story. He may not be entirely optimistic about Eros, but his vision of it is not devoid of hope. And he is, of course, to the Romantics, the towering figure of poetic fertility, the prince of the imagination. Though overtly he can be rather sweetly derisive about poetic power, he allows his Duke Theseus to mash the poet together with the lunatic and the lover. To the Romantics, he exemplifies imaginative power like no one before him or after. Love and imagination, or better, imagination inspired by love, fused with love. This is the possibility that the high Romantics offer and endorse as a potential form of renovation. Wordsworth ends his sonnet about the oppressions of the world with Triton blowing on his horn, a trope of music, and Proteus shifting his shape, a trope of the ever-changing power of imagination. And he cries out for a world not of Christian prohibition, but of pagan pleasure. He thrills to the sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the wind that will be blowing at all hours. He demands a more intense, joyous, and full life than anything that self and world can possibly provide. Again, the battle of self and soul is joined. What is culture now? To speak very crudely, it is the theater in which the old soul values and the new one, the romantic vision of imagination, fight what appears to be a losing battle. Perhaps the battle is already lost against the forces of the self. High culture has, following Freud, given up on the interfusion of love and imagination that is romanticism. Freud was consistently derisive about both love and imagination. Find that which Freud was most consistently derisive about, and you will see, perhaps, the portals of liberation. But everyday people have not given up on the romantic dream, not entirely. Love particularly draws them still. People will sacrifice wildly when they believe that they are making contact with that Aristophanic romantic figure, the soulmate. They pursue and pine and hunger and lose all they have or much of it because they believe that life should be more than a sad world of ever graying continuities. Some people, many of them poor, continue to believe in the great value of compassion, as it is bequeathed to them by the Hindu sages, Confucius, the Buddha, and by Jesus Christ of Nazareth. A few individuals inside universities and out, mostly out, continue to follow Plato's path as seekers of the truth, but they seem to be on the losing end of human history. Seen, but maybe not. For human beings also give evidence of not wanting to live forever in the toils of the selfhood. They can live quiet in the tomb a long time. Hundreds of years can pass, but then, in an instant, things sometimes begin to change. Thank you for listening. I mean, I've always wanted, and I've always kept a special place open in my heart for Jung because he takes Freud so seriously, but he's not willing to stop with Freud's telling us it's all self and that's all it is. Stop there. And so I don't necessarily read him with a sense of great accord, but I just respect the effort tremendously. And maybe this is just an attempt, another attempt to do what Jung tried to do. In terms of self and soul together, I think that, I think it is possible. I mean, I think about the poet Wallace Stevens, right? People say when Wallace Stevens entered the room, the temperature fell about 20 degrees. He was large and portly and kind of scowling and, was all dressed up and buttoned up and had his tie on and kind of, uncomfortable in his body. But then there were those gorgeous, glorious, subtle poems about Florida and about the imagination. He loved flowers. He loved the sky. He loved the mind, and he loved the contemplating a vase with flowers in it. And so he was able to cultivate the greatest delicacy within himself, even as he cultivated an exterior that was almost super businessman manly. Do you know what I mean? And Walt Whitman was much the same way. And it's kind of interesting that both of them were people who started out very late as poets. And Whitman doesn't really get going until he's in his mid-30s. And he sort of becomes Walt Whitman, one of the roughs, eating, drinking, brawling, the whole business. And that's his self. And he's very self-conscious about it, that he's going to create this thing. But then there's this part of him, too, where he says, apart from the pulling and hauling stands what I am, alone, compassionating, idle, unitary, looking out, peeping into this very Ariel-like androgynous figure. And he insists, somewhat in the line of your question, that it is possible to cultivate these two things at once. Partly as a kind of antidote to contemporary society, I'm very interested in figures who seem to have cultivated no self whatsoever. You know, people like Jesus and Socrates and the Buddha, and even in his way, Achilles, they don't have that protective self. They're just completely exposed all the time, and so they seem very reckless. You know, I mean, the Buddha seems to be completely exposed, though he lives in India, and people are much more forgiving, I guess, of that kind of thing there. But Jesus, it's a shocker that he lasts for 3 years, the way he behaves. You know, he's just constantly, when somebody says, "What do you think about this?" it tells him. You know, Roman soldiers, Jewish priests, he doesn't really care. Socrates, you ask him, he tells you. You know, Whitman's likely to be much archer. Stevens is likely to be much archer. And you say, why do you do that? And they say, well, if we didn't, we'd never have made it to 35 or 45. Stevens doesn't publish a volume until he's in his 40s. You know, he's building up the self and hiding the little. So you see, this really sends me going, this thing. But for the purposes of clarification, I wanted to imagine people who are completely selfless and sort of bring their example forward. Because I think they can attain remarkable things, you know. I promise not to answer every question at that extreme length. Yes?
I had a couple of questions, but I'll stick to this one for the moment.
Sure.
I was really interested in the way you revisited the sort of genealogy that the Boom establishes between Freud and Shakespeare. And this sort of connected to my question, which has to do with the absence of, or at least explicit absence of Nietzsche from your discussion. So part of my question would just be whether any discussion of Nietzsche fits into the larger project you're engaged in. And this interested me mainly because when I try to think about where to situate him on the sort of landscapes that you're mapping out, I find myself kind of feeling like he could, I mean, and certainly in Bloom's reading, you would imagine him being sort of slotted into that genealogy, but on the other hand, he clearly could be in the camp of Blake and of Yeats, certainly, as the sort of modern cultivators of soul in your terms. So I'm just sort of wondering, just because when I started thinking about it as you were talking about this, I didn't have a clear answer myself as to where you fit into it.
No, it's a wonderful question, and I really, really appreciate it. I think that some of my own attempts at thinking are somewhat guided by Nietzsche. And I guess, you know, part of that is that what I admire about Nietzsche is that the guy is willing to say anything, if he thinks it. You know, if Nietzsche were burned at Shakespeare, you'd hear about it. I don't say I'm burned at Shakespeare, it's ridiculous, but Nietzsche seems to me to be a person who helps a great deal by insisting that Homeric values are still tenable values. He's very excited about Homer his whole life, and he wants there to be a rebirth somehow of Homeric values. But where I part company with Nietzsche is in his sense that most Christian and Buddhist values are just indirect wills to power. Do you know? He says you must choose one of those two things, right? You're either the camp of compassion or the camp of courage. I think these are two different states of soul, and that somebody who fights bravely for his country or for his fellows is in a soul state, and somebody who is kind and looks out at his fellow men and women and says, I am you and you are me, is also in a soul state. Nietzsche thinks that most metaphysicians, like Plato, are deluders and deceivers, right? I find them to be ideal figures. He thinks they also have a will to power. In terms of poetry, he seems more friendly, but more scattered, too. So to me, you know, Nietzsche is somebody who I've sympathized with the desire to blow up bourgeois ideals, which is part of what he's trying to do. But I don't think that the only alternative to bourgeois ideal is a sort of Homeric intensity. I have a little phrase for Nietzsche in the book. I call him a timotic intellectual. That is, somebody who thinks that you can use your mind the way Achilles uses a sword. And he creates that prototype and sort of glories in it. And it is part of what makes me try to ponder what it would mean to combine these ideals. Can you be a compassionate thinker? Can you be both a thinker and a poet? This sort of thing. I don't really know the answer to any of those things yet, and I hope that I've managed to figure it out before the curtain falls down. Did you want to respond to that in any way?
Yeah, I think that did help me rethink some of what I was perplexed about, and I guess one thing that's interesting is the way that the figures of Socrates and Christ, in particular in Nietzsche, are actually ones that are treated, at least in my reading, with a lot of ambivalence.
Yeah.
And in other words, they're on one hand posed as the progenitors of these values that are inimical to life. Yet, on the other hand, they themselves, at least Socrates in the Birth of Tragedy and Christ in the Antichrist, are actually treated as not being equivalent to their followers, as
there's some of that,
themselves espousing some kind of values that are not simply equivalent to the values that they supposedly brought into existence.
That's a very shrewd distinction. It needs to be made, actually, if we're looking at things in a more subtle way, because you're reading the Anti-Christian or the Antichrist and you think Nietzsche's about to really tear off on Jesus, but there are those two beautiful pages about Jesus as a free spirit who acts from instinct and nothing else, and it's clear that he just loves this part of Jesus which he is being inspired by. And then Socrates, there'll be these most soaring recommendations of Socrates. And then, though, in genealogy in Birth of Tragedy, where it would really seem like it's time to say Plato's the bad guy, but Socrates was wonderful. He insisted Socrates was the bad guy. And I was like, why did you do that? And he felt like it. But then, as you say, all through the work is very inconsistent on the subject of Socrates. You could write a book called Nietzsche's Socrates. He just gives the guy the itch, and he never can get finished scratch. Just like Montaigne. Montaigne's never through with Socrates one way or another. But Montaigne is more consistently positive. I mean, Nietzsche can love-hate that guy forever. Anyway, thank you. I'd love to think about that stuff. Brilliant. Yes, please. What provoked me to write that? Sounds like one of the things that my mother used to say to me, like, what made you do that? I don't know, man. It just happened. I took a trip around the world with my family on this equivocal venture called Semester at Sea. And I had to teach something. And so, since I'm completely Eurocentric, whatever centric you got, and we were going around the world, I had to come up with something to teach. So I thought, I'll do philosophy East and West. So I did Plato and Nietzsche, which I thought myself familiar with. And I thought, well, what would be East? And I thought, well, I guess Buddha must be East. I guess Confucius must be East. And the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, things that I kind of was always vaguely interested in. So I read up and read up and read up. And I started to think, well, these, first of all, the resonance between what's going on in those texts and what's going on in the Gospels I found really fascinating. And then I tried to figure out what the tensions between the Gospels and the Hebrew Bible. And then I started to think about this in terms of possible human ideals, and it just seemed to make sense to talk about Plato as coming up with this ideal of the thinker, and you could see at Plato's back the whole time was this enormous problem with Homer, who he doesn't just dismiss the way people think so. He's just tremendous respect for him, and he really thinks Timos is this wonderful quality, but, so these three ideals started to come clear in my mind, and then I wanted to know, where did they go? And are they still alive? And what relationship does Romanticism, which I've been teaching for a long time, have to them? But sometimes as I was reading this, I felt like, I don't know if any of you are readers of The Old Man and the Sea, who just has the misfortune to catch a fish that's way too big for him at that particular, and he's sort of pulling away, and so I have a sense of some discovery, but also some fear that I'm not up to the task. So there's a part of me that when I give a talk like this, and I've probably given a dozen of them or so on the book, I'm waiting for somebody to say, this is really ridiculous, this is unilluminating, this is stupid. Then I can go home and just write short stories and essays and poems for the rest of my life, and be really much more easy to get along with my family than I'm in this wrestling match. So that's what made me, and what would unmake me would be somebody just saying, no, look, this, and this. So if anybody feels like doing that, I will not be mad. I'll be like, oh, thank you. I'm clean, I'm clear. It'd be jailbreak, Because really, who can talk about these things? Really, I'm a complete amateur. Yeah.
So what's interesting what you're saying about Hemingway's Old Man of the Sea and Santiago.
Yeah.
Following your ideas, would Santiago be someone who's radically into the self because it's misplaced courage altogether to go, extend yourself or catching a fish? Or does it become a symbol of something larger than that?
I don't remember the book that well. Do you know what I mean? I admit that I spent a lot of time trying to get my younger son to read it without rereading it myself, and really annoyed the heck out of him. But I do think, broadly speaking, that Hemingway is somebody who poses the question, particularly in the earlier books, of military courage and courage in life in general, and it answers, by and large, with a lot of serious reflection in the affirmative, and that's why he meant so much to people as he did. He wanted to say, this lives. This lives, and...
Except he rejects courage for country and just retreats into himself. He rejects a courage for country and becomes, he falls into serving just individual self. His characters, they make their separate peace and whatnot. He certainly, privileges courage, but it seems to be a different kind of courage than where you were going with your idea of courage and courage being.
I may not be able to call Hemingway well enough to mind to have a good conversation with you about it, but what I would say is that the Iliad gives us two models of courage. One is Hector, who fights for his city and for his family and for his children, and is really completely invested in the state, in the most admirable possible way. And the other is Achilles, who cares about his own maintaining of the standard of his honor, and that is it. Right? So maybe Hemingway's heroes are closer to that. And there are some people who don't like that. When I talk to students about, who's the real hero of this poem, a lot of them just say it's Hector, and Achilles is, he's just too much. He's too self-absorbed. But then I say to them, you're going out on patrol and you can only pick one guy. You know who you pick. You know who you pick.
Just one follow-up.
Sure.
What kind of heroism that someone has that becomes a shell and not really doesn't participate in, like the archetype, like the soul that you're suggesting becomes in other words, it's a heroism for the sake of heroism rather than a heroism serving some ideal.
Yeah, I think that can happen. I think that, one of the things I take out of Freud is that he's really terrific at getting to the heart of every one of the ideals and saying, what he says is, this is why it's inevitably corrupt. And what I hear him saying is, this is why it can be dramatically corrupted. And Freud's term for that kind of heroism is narcissism. And he's really good at describing it. And then you say to him, is there any form of heroism that is not narcissism? And the implicit answer is no. That's not possible. So is Hector a narcissist? Oh, yeah. I mean, he just, when he creates the human soul, his vision of the human soul, he says there's an ego, superego, and id. People say, well, that's a lot like Plato. But Plato is the reason and courage and the appetites, timos, right? There's no timos in Freud's soul. It's just gone, So, I think these ideals are corrupted all the time. And one of the things that's great about Nietzsche is if you want to know why, figures of compassion are corrupt, he's great at telling you the story about what weasels these people can be and how creepy they are and how they teach their heroes to think in a way that undermines them completely. And you think, do they all do that? And then you look around and say, no, I didn't really think so. There's some people who just I don't think Mother Teresa ever did that. She's all right with me. But Nietzsche and Freud are really tremendous at figuring out how ideals get corrupted. Just tremendous. But as great as they are, I don't kind of want to leave it there. Sure, please.
If you're familiar with the work of Owen Barfield.
Not much, no. Not much. Yeah, please.
As you are characterizing the difference between the self and the soul, I kept thinking of that the self was really a culture, and maybe by definition you were giving it to us that way, that it's insidious and pervasive in a culture, in a middle class, and that the states of the soul could be acquired individually. And I was wondering if you could comment on the difference between the collective and the individual, and whether it's possible for this to enter or infuse the collective with the state of the soul. Whether we're in so many dire situations around the world right now, where there's such anarchical, and agitation, as you refer to, in collective situations, and what will it take for collective energy to change to that hunger to be great enough to go into the soul?
Well, I think that cultures can be described as being more or less hospitable to soul, right? That is, to what degree does a given culture take a young person seriously? Well, I'll just tell you a story about this. I was talking to a group of psychoanalysts in New York City about these ideals, and one of them, a very nice man, stood up at the end and said, when a young person comes into my office and says, for all purposes, I want to devote myself to artistic genius or a life of compassion, or the life of the brilliant thinker, or the life of the heroic warrior, I say, my general assumption is that this is a psychoneurosis and it has to be cured, right? And I think that although psychoanalysis is very divorced from culture at large, I think that it speaks for culture. The job is already done. That doesn't need to happen much anymore, because those ideals have by and large been discredited by the contemporary culture. Anybody who maintains those, who's 17, 18, 19, is going to be laughed at. Anybody who's 50 or 60 who maintains those as ideals is going to be laughed at. But I think that if we are willing to be articulate about what these ideals are about, and how much people have grown from them, thrived in them, celebrated them over time, I think young people will be interested in them and be drawn to them. It's kind of a matter of forgetting, And I think that self is very natural. I mean, it's natural to be a self and to want what we want and to try to succeed and be important. And I mean, I feel all those things all the time. I'm good at them sometimes, but I feel them. And the soul thing is more often obscured, so that you see these scenes where Jesus will say to somebody, you can love God with your whole heart, your whole soul, and your whole mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, and then you'll be in heaven for all purposes. And the people around him say, "Whoa, yeah, that kind of. I really hadn't thought of that, but that does kind of resonate with me." Or the Buddha will talk to them about compassion, the needs for compassion, and the process by which these soul states are discovered is really mysterious and strange. But people come back, people do become articulate about them and inspire others in ways that are really unexpected. But they're also susceptible to amazing, it gets back to Nietzsche, they're susceptible to amazing degrees of corruption. But if you look at, for instance, ads on TV, I'll bet half the ads that you see on TV make some allusion to soul states. Do you know? Because that's the way you sell things, because people are still longing for them so much. See the soft drink, and everybody's kind of all getting together and loving each other. And, it's kind of like the miracle of the loaves and fishes. It's the miracle of the Coke and the Pepsi. But, that ain't how it was. But people burn for them, still. So, continuing to talk to young people about these things, about these possibilities, and to take them seriously, even as you say, they're also incredibly dangerous. They're really, they're playing with fire. And yet, it's what people found life to be about in the richest possible ways for thousands of years. And our society's turning away from them in a way that seems like they haven't been getting a fair enough trial. So, does that somewhat answer?
On the path, yeah.
On the path. That's all I want, is on the path. Yes?
In one reading, you wrote a portion of it about context and reading with context, and there are groups that include it, that exclude it, and it's kind of in contention. My question for you is, do you think that there is a level of context that allows for a better appreciation and understanding of a work, and is there also a level that is maybe too much and too high? My example would be, is it important to know that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in exile versus knowing that Dante's Inferno has been turned into a video game?
Uh-huh. Yeah. This may be just kind of a flaw of old age, but I'm inclined now to think that I want students to make contact with works, and Dante is a real puzzle here, that burn through context. I mean, the amazing thing about reading the Upanishads, or particularly the Bhagavad Gita, is that, it's however many thousands of years old, and it just comes right at you. You feel like this was written yesterday. And you feel that way with the Gospels, and I feel that way with Homer, though it's hard to get in there. I feel that way with Plato. He just reaches right out to you and says, here it is. Now is when it is. Part of my admiration for Dante is boundless, but the amount of immediacy that's required in order to read Dante is astonishing. The amount of learning, especially as you get to the Paradiso, is just blinding. To read one canto of the Paradiso, you have to be the most learned person alive. It's amazing. I listened to it on tape, and the Paradiso just blew me away. I couldn't keep up with it. And I think of myself as being reasonably well-educated in the ways of Christian doctrine. But a mouse I was. It's not because I don't necessarily like work or historical research, but the ability of some of these texts to be present is, to me, it's mind-blowing. And those are the ones that I gravitate to at this point. Even Shakespeare, as difficult as the language is, bang, there's a presence to it that's just blinding. It's blinding. Is it time to go home? Yes, please. Sure.
You had a brief remark towards the end about most people in university, or I think people advocating values of soul, and so you were describing them mostly not being in universities. And just, you're a professor at the University of Virginia, as I understand, and obviously are trying to advocate for those values. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you see the university fitting into the kind of advocacy and the kind of attempt to make contact with young people that you're describing.
The great mystery of my graduate school and assistant professorial education was like Derrida, de Man, Foucault, Rorty, pragmatism. These are really subversive things, and yet here they are in a university being taught by professors. And I thought, this is like rock and roll born again. But then I listened to what they say, and I didn't quite feel that way. Dick Rorty and I used to teach together all the time. And basically, the contention of the class would always be, when I would say to Dick, why don't you like Emerson? And he'd say, just don't really care for him. And, the reason is because Rorty was a pragmatist and somewhat in the camp of deconstruction, and I was an idealist and somewhat in the camp of transcendence and transcendentalism. And it took me about a decade to figure this out. And it also took me about a decade to figure out that the reason that deconstruction and Foucauldian critique were okay, I thought, was because they were not subversive, but they were completely in line with the overall designs of American education, which would be to undermine aspirations to idealism on the part of students and make them practical. If you can teach people how to say derisive things about Plato, if you can teach them how to say derisive things implicitly about religion, you can teach them to be, members of the middle-class society of self. So I was really bamboozled. What I thought was really cool and subversive and liberating was, I now feel not so much so. And as I bring this up to my colleagues, my colleagues at Virginia are great. They'll listen to anything. They're very open in certain ways. They'll read the stuff I write, listen to what I say. They don't agree, necessarily. But it's a good context for saying that. We're kind of state U, and we're teaching undergraduates and trying to figure out how to make that happen. But I find students very responsive to these questions. And when I do bring up ideals to them, I don't say, go find the equivalent of Mother Teresa and do likewise tomorrow, because there's much to be said. Nietzsche says some of it as a form of antagonism. But as part of a liberal arts education, you'd want to take these things seriously as as options, or at least as some part of your life, you know? If you're just a little more compassionate, what's that going to bring you? If you're just a little more courageous, what's that going to bring you? So I try to mix it into my teaching, to which, you know, my graduate students say, well, you have tenure, you can do anything you want to. I suppose there's truth in that, but nobody has to listen. Yes, please.
You mentioned that contemporary culture is a fabrication of the soul. And then you mentioned that there are 4 soul states.
Yeah.
Basically the warrior, the saint, the thinker, and the poet.
Yeah.
Right? So, and you've kind of come to my question in different ways, but I've just put this one question. So, what tools does a person need to have? What is it that they need to have to be sure that they're not, you know, thinking that they're in a state of soul when they're really in a state of self?
That's the tough one.
Yeah.
That's a really tough one. You know? I think it's a tremendous question. And I think that part of it might come from the way other people react. Do you know? I think that when people see real compassion in somebody, they get excited and they're drawn to it. And their hearts open up. I think when people see real, honest intellectual inquiry, they get excited and they're drawn to it and their hearts open up. Even though they also may get kind of mad sometimes, or kind of confused, but there's a sense of something going on, of excitement, of this is really working for me. You know, at least there'll be some group who, confronted by this change in the individual, are responsive in some exciting way. And I think the individual will say, well, she'll feel unity of being, right? And Freud says to us, anybody who feels unity of being is somebody who's like seriously screwed up. That's a fanatical, narcissistic person, you know? So all these checks have to be taken into account. And I really don't know the answer to the question. It's the very best in a certain way. How do you know? How do you know? Other people sometimes tell you, you know? They show you. But it's a hard one. It's a great question. Yeah?
Just kind of wondering, you talked a lot about Shakespeare, a bit about Wordsworth and Yeats and Blake.
Yeah.
Where do you put Milton in the march of ideas along your trajectory of soul?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. The last time I taught Milton's Paradise Lost, 2 things occurred. One, I was just flattened at his level of poetic prowess. The amazing expressive power that the man has just blew me away. You know, the description, particularly of God's creation of the earth, you know, and his depictions of Eve, whom he clearly adores, as well as being kind of really terrified and upset by. So that was one of the things. The other was a deep mistrust of anything that wasn't pretty well covered by paternal authority, you know? And so there would be, wouldn't be the first to find something like a split in Milton between an amazingly promising poetic intensity, the sort of thing that gets Blake really excited, and a commitment to real patriarchy, domination, authoritarianism, and a kind of blinkered sense of the world. And this, I think, is one of my example in the chapter on, should it ever be written, on imagination, is Blake's rewriting of Milton in the poem Milton. Because he sees exactly what I'm trying to express, though expresses it for a better. He says, this artist is amazing. Why is he on the side of limitation and, you know, patriarchy, you know, oppression? I don't get it. Let's open him up. But Blake loved Milton and revered him, and I have the same dual mind about him. All done?
Yeah, I think we better.
Thank you. I really learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming.